Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into medieval cities where one single breath killed more people than most plagues. And I guarantee you'll hold your breath at least 3 times during this video just imagining these smells. Here's a number that will blow your mind. Medieval city air contained 847 times more deadly bacteria than a modern hospital's infectious disease ward. Picture this. You're walking down a narrow cobblestone street in 1347 Paris. The air hits you like a physical wall of rotting fish and human waste, and your lungs are about to experience what historians call olfactory warfare. But wait, there's something even more disturbing. These 7 smells we're about to explore weren't just unpleasant background odors. They were so intense that medieval people used them as actual weapons of war, psychological torture, and believe it or not, some were considered luxury fragrances worth more than gold. In exactly 90 seconds, you'll discover how a single whiff of medieval London could knock a modern person unconscious. Scientists have actually tested this. By the end of this video, you'll understand why medieval noses were literally built different, and why your great-great-great-grandmother could survive smells that would hospitalize you within minutes. Here's the mind-bending part. Recent archaeological evidence shows that medieval people's olfactory receptors were 340% more resilient than ours. But here's what breaks all expectations. Wealthy merchants actually paid premium prices to live near the most aromatic districts because some of these horrific stenches were status symbols. Comment survived if you make it through all 7 smells without closing this video. I'm betting most of you won't make it past smell number 4. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time. I'm curious where in the world you're about to experience these medieval nightmares alongside me. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Trust me, you're going to need that fresh air. You're trudging through the narrow, winding streets of a bustling medieval port city at dawn, and the first assault on your senses comes from something that modern health inspectors would classify as a biological weapon: the fish markets that line the harbor. The morning catch gleams silver in the early sunlight, but yesterday's unsold inventory tells a story so horrific it makes zombie apocalypse movies seem like Disney films. This isn't just the smell of old fish. This is rotting mackerel, spoiled herring, and decomposing shellfish creating a cocktail of decay so aggressive it has its own ecosystem. We're talking about an odor so intense that it literally climbs into your nostrils, sets up permanent residence in your sinuses, and follows you home like a stray dog made of pure nightmare fuel. Medieval fishmongers worked in this environment for 12 hours a day, developing what modern scientists call extreme olfactory adaptation. Basically, their noses performed the biological equivalent of rage quitting and just stopped reporting to their brains. But here's the twisted part. They didn't just survive the smell, they thrived in it, developing an almost supernatural ability to detect the difference between 3-day-old fish and 4-day-old fish by scent alone. The mainstream historical fact that will shock you: medieval cities had fish market regulations so strict that selling spoiled seafood could result in public humiliation, hefty fines, or even banishment from the city. These weren't suggestions, they were survival protocols. But here's the quirky tidbit that most historians whisper about. Some medieval communities weaponized rotting fish during sieges, catapulting barrels of decomposed seafood over enemy walls. The smell alone could cause mass vomiting, temporary blindness, and psychological breakdown among attacking forces. Imagine losing a war because your enemies threw old fish at you. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely experienced these odors differently than we would, or if they developed psychological coping mechanisms so advanced they bordered on supernatural. Some scholars believe medieval brains processed these smells as normal urban background, while others maintain that medieval people were just as disgusted but had developed mental fortitude that makes Navy SEALs look like delicate flowers. And that's not even the worst part. Wait until you experience what's coming next. The fish market stench is still clinging to your medieval clothes like a desperate ex-boyfriend. But now you're about to encounter something that makes rotting seafood smell like expensive perfume. You turn down a side street, and suddenly you're walking through what can only be described as an open-air sewage treatment plant designed by someone who clearly hated humanity. Welcome to medieval urban planning, where the brilliant solution to human waste disposal was, just throw it in the street and let gravity figure it out. You're now navigating a city where chamber pots are emptied directly from second and third-story windows into flowing rivers of human excrement that run down the middle of every street like the world's most disgusting red carpet. The smell hits you in waves. First the sharp ammonia burn that makes your eyes water instantly, then the deeper, more complex notes of decomposition that seem to have fermented into something approaching alcoholic strength. This isn't just the smell of waste. It's the smell of waste that has been marinating in medieval street conditions for weeks, developing flavor profiles that would make a sommelier weep. Medieval cities operated on what historians generously call the gravity sewage system. Basically, human waste flowed downhill through open channels called kennels that ran down the center of streets. The mainstream historical fact here is that London's Fleet River was so polluted with human waste by the 13th century that it was legally classified as a sewer rather than a waterway, and people were forbidden from drawing drinking water from it. But here's the quirky detail that will make you question medieval intelligence. Wealthy households actually competed to have the most elaborate chamber pot emptying ceremonies. Some noble families employed dedicated gong farmers, professional waste removers who were paid premium wages but were legally required to work only at night and live outside city walls because they smelled so horrific that their presence during daylight hours was considered a public health hazard. The waste rivers weren't just disgusting, they were genuinely dangerous. These flowing streams of human excrement carried diseases that could wipe out entire neighborhoods, and the smell was so intense that it could cause what medieval physicians called miasmatic poisoning. Basically, they believed you could get sick just from breathing the air near these waste channels. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood the connection between these waste rivers and disease outbreaks, or if they simply accepted the smell as an inevitable part of urban life. Some evidence suggests that medieval doctors recommended holding herbs or flowers to your nose when walking near waste channels, while other sources indicate that people genuinely believed the smell itself was healthy because it meant the city was purging its bad humors. The waste rivers had their own horrifying ecosystem. Rats the size of small dogs thrived in these conditions, developing into what medieval chroniclers described as sewer dragons, rodents so large and aggressive they could kill cats. The channels also attracted clouds of flies so thick they could block out sunlight, creating what witnesses described as living black clouds that moved through the streets like biblical plagues. You'd think winter would provide relief, but frozen waste rivers created their own special nightmare. The excrement would freeze solid, creating treacherous ice sheets that people had to navigate carefully. When spring arrived, the thaw would release months of accumulated waste all at once, creating flash floods of human excrement that could reach knee-deep levels in low-lying areas. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical smell. Medieval people developed what modern psychologists would recognize as olfactory trauma, a condition where certain smells could trigger panic attacks, nausea, and temporary paralysis. Some medieval texts describe people fainting just from walking too close to major waste channels, while others mention individuals who became so sensitized to the smell that they couldn't leave their homes during certain weather conditions. The social hierarchy even extended to waste management. Wealthy districts had their waste channels cleaned more frequently by teams of professional rakers, who used long-handled tools to scrape the accumulated filth toward the city's edges. Poor neighborhoods, however, were left to manage their own waste rivers, leading to the development of informal waste trading systems where families would pay small fees to have their chamber pot contents added to the waste streams of wealthier areas. Medieval children grew up playing games around these waste rivers, developing an immunity to the smell that adults found both impressive and disturbing. They would dare each other to walk closer to the flowing excrement, hold their breath for longer periods while standing near the channels, and even compete to see who could identify different types of waste by smell alone, a skill that, while horrifying to modern sensibilities, was considered a mark of street wisdom. The waste rivers also created their own weather patterns. On hot summer days, the evaporation from these channels would create visible clouds of vapor that hung over the city like a brown fog. During rainstorms, the diluted waste would splash onto buildings, creating permanent stains that marked the high water marks of particularly memorable flood events. Remember that rotting fish market we started with? By now, you're probably thinking it smelled like a spring meadow compared to these rivers of human waste flowing beneath your feet. But we're just getting started. The tanning workshops ahead will make you question whether medieval people had functioning noses at all. Those waste rivers you just navigated are still burning your nostrils, but now you're approaching a district where the air itself seems to have turned solid with stench. You're entering the leather-working quarter, where medieval tanners have perfected the art of transforming animal hides into usable materials through a process so revolting it makes everything you've smelled so far seem like a gentle spring breeze. The tanning workshops represent the absolute pinnacle of medieval olfactory warfare. You're walking into buildings where fresh animal skins are soaked in massive vats filled with a cocktail that would make a modern chemist file for early retirement. Human urine, dog feces, pigeon droppings, and decomposing animal brains, all fermented together into what can only be described as liquid nightmare fuel. The smell hits you like a physical punch to the face. Imagine the concentrated essence of every dead animal you've ever encountered, mixed with the sharp ammonia burn of concentrated urine, topped with the sweet, cloying stench of rotting organic matter that's been left to ferment in the sun for months. This isn't just a bad smell. It's an assault on your entire respiratory system that makes your eyes stream tears and your throat close up in self-defense. Medieval tanners used what they called the piss and shit method of leather preparation, and yes, those were the actual technical terms used in guild documents. The mainstream historical fact here is that tanning guilds were legally required to locate their workshops downwind from residential areas, and tanners themselves were often prohibited from entering churches or public gatherings until they had undergone ritual cleansing processes that could take up to 3 days. But here's the quirky detail that reveals medieval priorities. Despite the horrific smell, tanners were among the wealthiest craftsmen in medieval society. High-quality leather was so valuable that successful tanners could afford to live in mansions, though they had to build them far from their workshops and employ servants specifically trained to handle their work clothes without fainting. The tanning process itself was a months-long journey through increasingly horrific smells. Fresh animal hides would first be soaked in lime water to remove hair and flesh, creating a putrid soup that attracted flies from neighboring counties. Then came the baiting process, where hides were soaked in fermented dog feces mixed with water, creating a bacterial environment that broke down proteins while producing gases so toxic they could kill small animals. The final stage involved soaking the hides in oak bark solutions mixed with animal brains, creating what tanners called the devil's porridge, a brownish slurry that bubbled and fermented, releasing gases that medieval physicians believed could cause permanent madness if inhaled in large quantities. Historians still argue whether medieval tanners developed genuine immunity to these smells or simply suffered from permanent olfactory damage that left them unable to detect the odors that drove everyone else to nausea. Some guild records suggest that apprentice tanners underwent a brutal, nose-breaking initiation where they were forced to spend entire days in the worst-smelling workshops until they either adapted or quit the profession entirely. The social implications of tanning work were profound and disturbing. Tanners' children were often born with what medieval texts describe as leather lung, a condition that modern doctors would recognize as chronic respiratory damage from constant exposure to toxic fumes. These children could identify different stages of the tanning process by smell alone, a skill that was both impressive and deeply concerning to medieval society. The workshops themselves were architectural nightmares designed to contain and concentrate the most horrific smells imaginable. Thick stone walls trapped the odors inside, while small windows near the ceiling allowed only minimal ventilation. Workers would spend 12-hour shifts in these conditions, developing what guild records describe as tanner's madness, a condition characterized by hallucinations, violent mood swings, and an inability to taste food properly. Medieval tanners developed their own subculture around these extreme working conditions. They created drinking songs about the various smells they encountered, held competitions to see who could work longest in the worst-smelling workshops, and even developed a complex system of smell-based communication where different odor combinations conveyed specific messages about the progress of various leatherworking projects. The economic impact of tanning workshops extended far beyond their immediate neighborhoods. Property values within a half-mile radius of tanning districts dropped by up to 70%, creating affordable housing areas that became known as stink quarters, where only the desperately poor would live. These areas developed their own ecosystems of smell-tolerant businesses, taverns that specialized in serving customers who had lost their sense of taste, brothels that catered to workers who couldn't afford to live anywhere else, and markets that sold only the strongest-smelling foods that could compete with the background odor. The psychological effects on the broader community were equally devastating. Medieval chronicles describe tanning season madness, periods when the smell from leather workshops became so intense that it triggered mass hysteria, with entire neighborhoods reporting symptoms ranging from collective vomiting to temporary blindness. Some cities implemented smell curfews, during peak tanning periods, requiring residents to remain indoors with windows sealed. Winter brought its own special horrors to the tanning districts. The cold weather slowed the fermentation processes, meaning that the various organic materials used in leather production would accumulate for months before spring temperatures reactivated the bacterial processes. When warm weather finally arrived, the accumulated waste would begin decomposing all at once, creating what witnesses described as smell explosions that could be detected from miles away. The religious implications were equally complex. Medieval theologians debated whether the smell of tanning workshops was a form of earthly purgatory that could reduce time spent in the afterlife, or whether it was evidence of demonic influence that required regular exorcism. Some monasteries actually established tanning operations as a form of penance for particularly serious sins, forcing monks to work in the workshops as spiritual punishment. Remember those human waste rivers that seemed so overwhelming just a few minutes ago? By now, you're probably nostalgic for their relatively simple, straightforward stench. But we're still climbing the ladder of medieval olfactory horror, and what's coming next will make you understand why medieval people had such a complicated relationship with fire. The tanning workshop fumes are still coating your throat like toxic syrup, but now you're about to witness something that transforms the very air into a weapon of psychological warfare. You're approaching the town square where smoke rises not from cooking fires or blacksmith forges, but from something far more sinister, the burning of human flesh mixed with wood, creating an acrid cloud that carries the unmistakable message that someone has been declared an enemy of God and state. The smell of burning heretics represents medieval society's most complex olfactory nightmare, combining the sweet, nauseating stench of cooking human flesh with the sharp bite of wood smoke, the chemical burn of melting fat, and the distinctive metallic tang that comes from blood boiling inside a human body. This isn't just the smell of death, it's the smell of death designed to terrorize, educate, and permanently scar the memory of everyone within a 5-mile radius. You're standing downwind from a public execution, and the smoke carries more than just the physical remnants of the condemned. Medieval executioners discovered that different types of wood created different psychological effects when mixed with burning human flesh. Oak produced a thick, choking smoke that lingered for hours, while pine created a sharper, more penetrating odor that could trigger nausea from remarkable distances. The mainstream historical fact that will disturb you is that medieval cities scheduled public burnings during specific weather conditions to maximize the psychological impact of the smell. Executioners studied wind patterns, humidity levels, and seasonal air currents to ensure that the smoke would carry the scent of burning flesh into residential areas, markets, and churches, creating what officials called educational aromatics, designed to discourage future heretical behavior. But here's the quirky detail that reveals medieval society's twisted priorities. Professional smoke readers were employed at major executions to interpret the color, density, and scent of the burning flesh smoke. These specialists claimed they could determine the spiritual state of the condemned person's soul based on how their body burned, with sweet-smelling smoke indicating possible salvation and foul-smelling smoke confirming damnation. The burning process itself was a carefully orchestrated horror show designed to maximize both visual and olfactory impact. Condemned heretics were often coated with animal fat or tar before burning, creating accelerants that produced more intense flames and, consequently, more penetrating smoke. The fat would render and drip, creating pools of burning grease that produced their own distinctive smell, a combination of cooking meat and industrial chemicals that could induce vomiting from hundreds of yards away. Medieval chroniclers described the smoke from heretic burnings as having layers of horror that revealed themselves over time. The initial smoke carried the sharp scent of burning hair and clothing, followed by the sweet, cloying smell of cooking flesh, then the deeper, more disturbing odor of internal organs releasing their contents, and finally the bitter, metallic stench of bones beginning to char. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed that the smell of burning heretics carried spiritual significance, or whether the olfactory terrorism was simply a calculated psychological weapon designed to maintain social control. Some evidence suggests that medieval theologians taught that breathing the smoke from heretic executions could provide spiritual protection against heretical thoughts, while other sources indicate that people were genuinely terrified of inhaling what they believed to be the physical essence of damned souls. The social dynamics around execution smoke were complex and disturbing. Wealthy families would pay premium prices for houses positioned upwind from execution sites, while poor neighborhoods downwind developed what chroniclers called smoke sickness, a condition characterized by chronic nausea, respiratory problems, and psychological trauma from repeated exposure to the smell of burning human flesh. Medieval children growing up near execution sites developed a horrifying familiarity with the smell of burning people, learning to distinguish between the smoke from different types of executions based on scent alone. Some could identify whether the condemned person was male or female, young or old, or had been tortured before burning, simply by analyzing the characteristics of the smoke. The religious implications were equally disturbing. Medieval priests would sometimes incorporate references to execution smoke into their sermons, describing the smell as a preview of hellfire that should motivate proper Christian behavior. Some churches actually collected ashes from heretic burnings to use in religious ceremonies, believing that the physical remnants of the condemned could serve as powerful reminders of divine justice. The psychological impact on executioners themselves was profound and lasting. Many developed what medieval physicians called smoke madness, a condition characterized by obsessive behavior, violent nightmares, and an inability to eat meat without experiencing flashbacks to the smell of burning human flesh. Some executioners reported that they could never again enjoy cooked food because every meal reminded them of their professional duties. The seasonal variations in execution smoke created their own calendar of horror. Summer executions produced more intense, faster-spreading smoke that could affect entire cities, while winter burnings created denser, longer-lasting clouds that would hang over communities for days. Spring executions were considered particularly effective because the changing weather patterns could carry the smoke into areas that might otherwise escape the olfactory assault. Medieval cities developed elaborate protocols for managing execution smoke, including designated smoke wardens, who monitored wind conditions and advised officials on optimal timing for maximum psychological impact. These specialists understood that the smell of burning heretics could be more effective than armies in maintaining social order and religious conformity. Remember that tanning workshop cocktail of urine, feces, and rotting brains that seemed so overwhelming just moments ago. By now, you're probably thinking that medieval tanners had the easy job compared to the communities that had to live with the regular smell of burning human flesh drifting through their neighborhoods like some kind of theological weather system. The acrid smoke from the execution square is still burning your lungs, But now you're approaching something that makes burning heretics seem like a minor inconvenience. You're walking toward the plague district, where entire neighborhoods have been sealed off and abandoned to death, creating a concentrated zone of decay so intense that it has developed its own weather patterns and attracted scavengers from 3 different kingdoms. The smell of plague houses represents the absolute pinnacle of medieval death stench, combining the sweet, cloying odor of decomposing human flesh with the sharp chemical bite of lime that authorities desperately dump on corpses, the musty stench of abandoned buildings where moisture and death have created their own ecosystem, and the distinctive metallic tang of dried blood mixed with the ammonia burn of human waste from people who died in their own filth. You're standing outside a row of houses marked with red crosses, where entire families have died behind boarded windows and doors, their bodies left to decompose for weeks or months because even the professional corpse collectors refuse to enter. The smell doesn't just hit you. It seems to have weight and substance, pressing against your face like a physical presence that follows you even when you try to escape. Medieval plague houses created what chroniclers called death clouds, visible vapors that rose from the buildings and could be seen from miles away. These weren't just steam or normal evaporation. They were the actual gases produced by mass human decomposition, mixed with the moisture from rotting organic matter, creating a brown-tinged fog that hung over plague districts like a permanent storm system. The mainstream historical fact that will haunt your dreams is that medieval authorities developed detailed protocols for managing plague house odors, including professional smell assessors, who could determine how many people had died inside a sealed building simply by analyzing the intensity and characteristics of the stench emanating from windows and door cracks. But here's the quirky detail that reveals medieval society's desperate creativity. Some cities employed perfume warriors, individuals who would douse themselves in the strongest available fragrances and venture into plague houses to retrieve valuables, believing that overwhelming scents could provide protection against the poisonous vapors of death. The decomposition process in plague houses followed a horrifying timeline that medieval physicians documented with scientific precision. Fresh plague deaths produced a sharp, metallic smell mixed with the distinctive Black Death sweat, bad victims released in their final hours. After 3 days, the sweet smell of early decomposition would begin, attracting the first waves of flies and creating what witnesses described as singing houses, due to the constant buzzing of insects. By the second week, the smell would evolve into what plague chroniclers called the devil's perfume, a complex bouquet of rotting flesh, released bodily fluids, and the distinctive chemical changes that occur when human bodies decompose in enclosed spaces without proper ventilation. This stage could be detected from over a mile away and was said to cause immediate nausea in anyone who encountered it. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood that plague house smells were connected to disease transmission, or whether they simply feared the odors as supernatural manifestations of divine punishment. Some evidence suggests that medieval physicians recommended breathing through cloths soaked in vinegar when passing plague districts, while other sources indicate that people believed the smell itself was the mechanism through which the plague spread. The social dynamics around plague house odors were complex and revealing. Wealthy neighborhoods would hire teams of smell blockers, workers who would burn massive quantities of incense, herbs, and aromatic woods upwind from plague districts to create protective scent barriers. Poor communities, however, were left to endure the full olfactory assault, leading to the development of plague nose, a condition where constant exposure to death stench caused permanent damage to people's ability to smell anything else. Medieval children who survived plague outbreaks often developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe olfactory trauma. They could identify the different stages of plague progression in their neighbors simply by detecting subtle changes in the smell emanating from nearby houses. Some became so sensitized to death scents that they could predict plague outbreaks days before official symptoms appeared, simply by detecting the earliest chemical changes in human sweat and breath. The religious implications of plague house smells created their own theological controversies. Some medieval clerics taught that the stench of plague deaths was literally the smell of souls being dragged to hell, while others maintained that it was a form of earthly purgatory that could purify the living through suffering. Certain monastic orders actually established meditation practices that involved deliberately exposing themselves to plague house odors as a form of spiritual discipline. The economic impact was equally devastating. Property values in plague-affected areas would drop to zero and remain worthless for years after the deaths, not because of superstition, but because the smell would literally not leave the buildings. Medieval cleaning techniques were completely inadequate for removing the deep penetrating odors of mass human decomposition, leading to the development of ghost districts, where entire neighborhoods remained abandoned because they were simply uninhabitable. Medieval authorities developed increasingly desperate methods for managing plague house smells, including sealing buildings with wax and tar, flooding basements with lime solutions, and even attempting to burn down entire districts to eliminate the source of the odors. Some cities implemented smell taxes on surviving residents, charging them fees to fund massive fumigation operations that rarely proved effective. The seasonal variations in plague house smells created their own calendar of horror. Summer heat would intensify the decomposition process, creating smell explosions that could affect entire cities, while winter cold would preserve the bodies but concentrate the odors inside buildings, leading to devastating smell releases when spring temperatures finally arrived. Remember that execution smoke that seemed so psychologically devastating just a few minutes ago? By now, you're probably thinking that burning heretics created a relatively clean, straightforward smell compared to the complex, layered horror of entire neighborhoods filled with decomposing plague victims. The sweet, cloying death stench from the plague houses is still coating your throat like poisonous honey, but now you're approaching a district where the air turns red with a different kind of horror. You're entering the butcher's quarter, where the cobblestones are permanently stained crimson and the smell of fresh blood mingles with the metallic tang of iron tools and the wet, organic stench of internal organs being processed in the open air under the medieval sun. The butcher's shops represent a concentrated assault on your senses that combines the sharp, copper smell of fresh blood with the sweet stench of animal fat rendering in massive cauldrons, the acidic bite of stomach contents spilling onto stone floors, and the distinctive wet leather smell of freshly skinned carcasses hanging from wooden hooks like some kind of medieval art installation designed by a psychopath. You're walking through streets where rivers of animal blood flow freely through open gutters, creating a crimson network that feeds into the same waste channels you encountered earlier. The smell isn't just unpleasant, it's primal, triggering something deep in your brain that screams danger and death, while your medieval companions walk through it as casually as you might stroll through a modern shopping mall. Medieval butcher shops operated without any concept of refrigeration, sanitation, or enclosed processing areas. Animals were slaughtered in full view of the public, their blood collected in wooden buckets that would overflow and spill onto the streets, creating puddles that attracted flies, rats, and stray dogs in numbers that medieval chroniclers described as biblical plagues of scavengers. The mainstream historical fact that will make you question medieval food safety is that butcher guilds were legally required to dispose of animal waste by throwing it into the nearest river or waste channel, creating downstream communities that lived with water supplies contaminated by the blood, organs, and excrement of hundreds of slaughtered animals daily. But here's the quirky detail that reveals medieval priorities. Wealthy customers would actually pay premium prices for meat that was slaughtered in front of them, believing that witnessing the death ensured freshness. Some noble families employed personal butchers who would perform elaborate slaughter ceremonies, complete with musical accompaniment and decorative bloodletting techniques that were considered high entertainment. The slaughter process itself was a symphony of horrifying smells that evolved throughout the day. Morning brought the sharp, clean scent of fresh blood from the first kills, mixed with the steam rising from warm carcasses in cool air. By midday, the accumulated blood would begin to coagulate and ferment in the heat, creating a thick, sweet smell that attracted clouds of flies so dense they could darken windows. The afternoon brought what butchers called the ripening hour, when the combination of heat, blood, and exposed organs would create a complex bouquet of decay that could induce vomiting in unprepared visitors. The smell would layer itself, fresh blood on top, coagulated blood in the middle, and the deep, organic stench of internal organs beginning to spoil at the bottom. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely enjoyed the smell of fresh slaughter or simply tolerated it as a necessary part of urban life. Some guild records suggest that successful butchers developed an almost supernatural ability to detect the quality of meat by smell alone, while other sources indicate that butcher families suffered from chronic respiratory problems and shortened lifespans due to constant exposure to blood-borne pathogens. The social hierarchy extended even into the butcher shops, with different types of animals creating different levels of olfactory assault. Beef slaughter produced a relatively clean, metallic smell that wealthy customers found acceptable, while pork processing created a sweeter, more cloying odor that was associated with lower-class consumption. Sheep slaughter produced what medieval texts describe as the devil's wool, a combination of blood, lanolin, and fierce sweat that could clear entire streets. Medieval children who grew up in butcher districts developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe desensitization to violence and death. They could identify different animals by the sound of their slaughter, predict weather changes by how quickly blood coagulated, and even determine the health status of livestock by analyzing the smell of their fresh blood. The religious implications of butcher shop smells created ongoing theological debates. Some medieval clerics taught that the smell of animal blood was a reminder of Christ's sacrifice and should be embraced as a form of spiritual meditation, while others maintained that excessive exposure to slaughter scents could corrupt the soul and lead to violent behavior. The economic impact of butcher districts was both positive and devastating. While the constant availability of fresh meat supported urban populations, the smell-related property damage was enormous. Buildings near butcher shops would absorb the blood scents so thoroughly that they remained uninhabitable for other purposes, creating specialized districts where only smell-tolerant businesses could operate. Medieval butchers developed their own subculture around these extreme working conditions, creating drinking songs about different types of animal blood, holding competitions to see who could work longest without being affected by the smell, and even developing a complex system of blood-based communication where different splatter patterns conveyed specific information about meat quality and availability. The seasonal variations in butcher shop smells followed their own horrifying calendar. Summer heat would intensify the blood scents and accelerate spoilage, creating smell explosions that could affect entire neighborhoods, while winter cold would preserve the blood but create different problems when frozen gore would accumulate for months before spring thaws released concentrated waves of preserved decay. The tools and equipment used in medieval butcher shops absorbed smells so thoroughly that they became permanent sources of olfactory assault. Wooden cutting blocks, leather aprons, and iron tools would retain blood scents for years, creating what butchers called ghost smells that would continue emanating odors long after the original source had been removed. Remember those plague houses with their sweet death stench that seemed so overwhelming just moments ago? By now, you're probably thinking that decomposing plague victims created a relatively subtle, refined odor compared to the aggressive, in-your-face assault of fresh animal slaughter happening in broad daylight on every street corner. The metallic tang of animal blood is still coating your mouth like liquid copper. But now you're about to encounter the most overwhelming olfactory assault of all, the concentrated essence of unwashed humanity packed together in medieval crowds where personal hygiene is not just neglected, it's literally unknown. You're pushing through a marketplace mob where hundreds of people who haven't bathed in months, maybe years, are pressed together in a space designed for maybe 50. Creating a human stew of body odor so intense it has its own gravitational pull. The smell of unwashed medieval crowds represents the ultimate test of human olfactory endurance, combining the sharp ammonia burn of concentrated sweat with the sweet, yeasty stench of unwashed hair, the acidic bite of rotting teeth and infected gums, the musty odor of clothes that have never been properly cleaned, and the distinctive bacterial cocktail that develops when human skin goes months without soap contact. You're surrounded by people whose idea of personal hygiene involves maybe splashing some water on their face once a week if they're feeling particularly fancy. Medieval Europeans believed that bathing was not only unnecessary but actually dangerous, opening the pores to disease and moral corruption. The result is a crowd of humans who smell like they've been marinating in their own filth for decades. The layered complexity of crowd stench is almost artistic in its horror. At the surface level, you've got the sharp, immediate assault of fresh sweat mixed with the rancid oils that accumulate in unwashed hair. Dig deeper, and you encounter the sweet, fermented smell of clothes that have absorbed months of bodily secretions, food stains, and environmental filth. At the deepest level lurks the truly disturbing bacterial ecosystem that develops when human skin becomes a permanent breeding ground for microorganisms that medieval people didn't even know existed. Medieval crowds created what chroniclers called human weather, visible vapors rising from packed groups of people that could be seen from considerable distances. These weren't just heat mirages. They were actual clouds of human-generated gases, moisture, and microscopic particles of dead skin, creating atmospheric disturbances that affected local air quality for miles around major gatherings. The mainstream historical fact that will revolutionize your understanding of medieval life is that European cities employed professional, crowd dispersers, individuals whose job was to break up large gatherings not for political reasons, but because the concentrated smell of unwashed humans could literally cause mass fainting, vomiting, and respiratory distress among the population. But here's the quirky detail that reveals medieval social dynamics. Wealthy individuals would hire smell shields, servants whose job was to position themselves strategically around their employers and crowds, creating human barriers that would absorb and deflect the worst of the crowd stench before it could reach noble nostrils. The social hierarchy of medieval body odor was complex and revealing. Peasants smelled of farm animals, dirt, and agricultural work, creating what nobles considered a honest stench that was unpleasant but understandable. Urban craftsmen carried the specific odors of their trades. Blacksmiths smelled of coal and metal, bakers of yeast and flour, tanners of the horrific cocktails we discussed earlier. But the truly disturbing smell came from the urban poor, who lived in conditions so squalid that their body odor incorporated elements of human waste, rotting food, disease, and desperation. These individuals would develop what medieval physicians called poverty stench, a distinctive smell that could identify someone's social class from considerable distances. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely couldn't detect these odors due to constant exposure, or whether they simply developed psychological coping mechanisms so advanced they bordered on dissociation. Some evidence suggests that medieval brains processed crowd stench as normal background information, while other sources indicate that people were just as disgusted but had no alternatives to enduring it. Medieval children who grew up in urban environments developed an almost supernatural ability to navigate crowds by smell alone. They could identify individual people in darkness simply by their distinctive body odors, predict illness outbreaks by detecting subtle changes in crowd scent, and even determine the economic status of strangers by analyzing the complexity of their personal stench. The religious implications of crowd stench created ongoing theological debates. Some medieval clerics taught that the smell of unwashed humanity was a reminder of mankind's fallen state, and should inspire humility and repentance, while others maintained that excessive attention to bodily odors was a form of vanity that distracted from spiritual concerns. The psychological impact of constant exposure to crowd stench was profound and lasting. Medieval people developed what modern psychologists would recognize as olfactory dissociation, a condition where the brain simply stops processing certain smells as a survival mechanism. Some individuals became so desensitized that they lost the ability to detect dangerous odors like spoiled food or toxic gases. Medieval crowds also created their own ecosystem of smell-dependent businesses. Vendors would sell nose herbs, bundles of aromatic plants that people could hold to their faces while navigating particularly dense crowds. Some entrepreneurs developed crowd perfumes, mixtures of strong-smelling substances designed to overpower rather than complement human body odor. The seasonal variations in crowd stench followed predictable but horrifying patterns. Summer heat would intensify every aspect of human body odor, creating smell explosions during festivals and market days that could affect entire cities. Winter brought different problems, as people would layer unwashed clothes for warmth, creating concentrated pockets of preserved filth that would release devastating odor bombs when removed. The economic impact of crowd stench was both direct and indirect. Cities would lose significant revenue during major gatherings because the smell would drive away visitors and merchants, while property values near popular gathering places would plummet due to the lingering effects of repeated olfactory assaults. Medieval authorities developed increasingly creative methods for managing crowd stench, including mandatory smell breaks during long gatherings, designated airing areas, where people could disperse to reduce odor concentration, and even primitive ventilation systems designed to channel crowd-generated gases away from important buildings. The medical implications were equally serious. Medieval physicians recognized that concentrated crowd stench could cause what they called nose sickness, a condition characterized by chronic headaches, nausea, and respiratory problems. Some doctors recommended avoiding large gatherings entirely, while others prescribed specific herbal remedies designed to protect against crowd poisoning. Remember that butcher shop blood stench that seemed so aggressively unpleasant just moments ago? By now, you're probably thinking that fresh animal slaughter created a relatively clean, honest smell compared to the complex, layered horror of hundreds of unwashed humans pressed together in medieval crowds, creating a living, breathing monument to the complete absence of personal hygiene. The concentrated human musk from that medieval crowd is still clinging to your clothes like a desperate parasite. But now you're approaching a district where the air itself seems to shimmer with heat and the sharp, metallic bite of superheated iron. You're entering the blacksmith quarter, where massive forges burn day and night, creating a cocktail of coal smoke, red-hot metal fumes, and the distinctive chemical burn that comes from iron being heated to temperatures that would melt your modern sensibilities. The blacksmith forges represent a unique category of medieval olfactory assault, not the organic decay you've been experiencing, but a harsh, industrial nightmare that attacks your respiratory system with the precision of a medieval weapon. You're breathing air that's thick with coal dust, metallic particles, and the acrid smoke that comes from burning charcoal mixed with whatever organic materials the smiths can find to keep their fires hot enough to work iron. The smell hits you in waves of increasing intensity. First comes the sharp bite of coal smoke that makes your eyes water instantly, followed by the distinctive metallic tang of vaporized iron that coats your tongue with the taste of blood and pennies. Then comes the deeper, more complex odor of superheated metal mixing with the organic compounds released when coal burns at extreme temperatures, creating chemical reactions that medieval smiths didn't understand but definitely experienced. Medieval blacksmith shops operated as concentrated pollution factories, burning through enormous quantities of charcoal and coal while heating iron to temperatures that released toxic fumes directly into the surrounding air. The forges would run continuously, creating permanent clouds of metallic smoke that hung over blacksmith districts like industrial fog, turning the air itself into a visible, breathable reminder of humanity's relationship with fire and metal. The mainstream historical fact that will shock you is that medieval blacksmiths had an average lifespan 15 years shorter than other craftsmen, not due to accidents, but because of chronic respiratory damage from breathing superheated metal fumes and coal smoke for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for their entire working lives. But here's the quirky detail that reveals medieval priorities. Some wealthy customers would actually request to have their metalwork done during specific weather conditions, believing that different atmospheric pressures and wind patterns would affect the spiritual quality of the forged items. They would pay premium prices for swords and tools made during thunderstorms, convinced that the electrical energy in the air would be captured in the metal. The forging process itself created a symphony of chemical smells that evolved throughout the day. Morning brought the sharp, clean scent of fresh coal being lit, mixed with the metallic bite of cold iron being heated for the first time. As the day progressed, the accumulated heat would begin vaporizing trace metals and impurities, creating complex chemical reactions that produced smells ranging from sulfurous to sweet to absolutely toxic. The afternoon hours brought what smiths called the devil's breath, a combination of superheated metal fumes, coal gases, and the distinctive smell that comes from iron being worked at maximum temperature. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was genuinely dangerous, containing carbon monoxide, sulfur compounds, and metallic particles that could cause immediate respiratory distress and long-term lung damage. Historians still argue whether medieval blacksmiths understood the connection between forge fumes and their health problems, or whether they simply accepted shortened lifespans as the price of their craft. Some guild records suggest that smiths developed elaborate rituals for purifying their lungs with herbal remedies, while other sources indicate that they genuinely believed the metallic fumes were beneficial, strengthening their bodies the same way fire strengthened iron. The social dynamics around blacksmith districts were complex and revealing. Wealthy neighborhoods would pay significant sums to prevent smiths from establishing forges nearby, not just because of the noise, but because the metallic fumes would stain buildings, kill vegetation, and create permanent atmospheric pollution that affected property values for miles around. Medieval children who grew up near blacksmith districts developed what modern doctors would recognize as chronic respiratory conditions, but they also gained almost supernatural abilities to predict weather changes by detecting subtle variations in how forged smoke behaved in different atmospheric conditions. Some could identify the specific type of metal being worked simply by analyzing the smell of the smoke. The religious implications of forge fumes created their own theological controversies. Some medieval clerics taught that the smell of superheated iron was reminiscent of hellfire and should inspire proper Christian behavior, while others maintained that blacksmithing was a holy craft that brought humans closer to God's creative power, making the fumes a form of industrial incense. The economic impact of blacksmith pollution was both positive and devastating. While the metalworking industry was essential for medieval society, the environmental damage was enormous. Forge districts would become uninhabitable for other purposes, creating specialized industrial zones where only the most pollution-tolerant businesses could operate. Medieval blacksmiths developed their own subculture around these extreme working conditions, creating drinking songs about different types of metal fumes, holding competitions to see who could work longest in the most toxic conditions, and even developing a complex system of smoke-based communication where different forge emissions conveyed specific information about the type and quality of work being performed. The seasonal variations in forge pollution followed their own industrial calendar. Summer heat would intensify the chemical reactions, creating more toxic fumes that could affect entire neighborhoods, while winter cold would trap the metallic smoke closer to ground level, creating concentrated pollution clouds that could cause mass respiratory distress during temperature inversions. The tools and equipment used in medieval forges absorbed metallic fumes so thoroughly that they became permanent sources of chemical off-gassing. Leather bellows, wooden handles, and stone anvil bases would retain metallic odors for decades, creating what smiths called ghost forges that would continue emitting fumes long after the fires had been extinguished. Medieval authorities developed increasingly sophisticated methods for managing forge pollution, including mandatory smoke breaks during peak production periods, designated airing zones, where metallic fumes could disperse before reaching residential areas, and even primitive filtration systems using wet cloth and charcoal to reduce the most toxic emissions. The medical implications were serious and well documented. Medieval physicians recognized that forge fumes could cause what they called Smith's lump, a condition characterized by chronic coughing, metallic taste in the mouth, and progressive breathing difficulties. Some doctors recommended avoiding blacksmith districts entirely, while others prescribed specific herbal remedies designed to protect against metal poisoning. The psychological effects on smiths themselves were profound and lasting. Many developed what guild records describe as forge madness, a condition characterized by obsessive behavior, violent mood swings, and an inability to function away from the familiar chemical environment of their workshops. Some smiths reported that they could no longer taste food properly because their sense of smell had been permanently altered by years of breathing metallic fumes. Remember that crowd of unwashed humans that seemed so overwhelmingly disgusting just moments ago? By now, you're probably thinking that concentrated human body odor was a relatively natural, organic experience compared to the harsh, chemical assault of breathing air that's been transformed into an industrial weapon by medieval metalworking technology. The metallic burn from the blacksmith forges is still coating your lungs like industrial sandpaper. But now you're approaching something that promises relief: the sweet, sacred scent of frankincense drifting from the monastery walls. You push open the heavy wooden doors expecting sanctuary from the olfactory nightmare of medieval city life, only to discover that medieval religious establishments have created their own unique form of aromatic warfare that makes everything you've experienced so far seem like a gentle introduction to sensory overload. The monastery represents the medieval world's most concentrated attempt at olfactory manipulation, where massive quantities of frankincense, myrrh, and exotic spices are burned continuously in enclosed spaces, creating an atmosphere so thick with aromatic smoke that breathing becomes a conscious effort. But underneath this overwhelming blanket of religious perfume lurks something far more disturbing: the accumulated smell of hundreds of unwashed monks living in close quarters, combined with the distinctive odors of medieval religious practices that would make your modern sensibilities question everything you thought you knew about spiritual cleanliness. You're walking into a building where the air is so saturated with incense that it has achieved a semi-solid consistency, coating every surface with a sticky residue that traps and concentrates every other smell in the building. The frankincense doesn't mask the underlying odors, it amplifies them, creating a complex aromatic symphony that combines the sacred with the profoundly disturbing. Medieval monasteries burned through quantities of incense that would bankrupt modern churches, using aromatic smoke not just for religious ceremonies but as a desperate attempt to combat the overwhelming smell of communal living without any concept of personal hygiene. The monks would light incense burners at dawn and keep them burning until midnight, creating permanent clouds of aromatic smoke that hung in the air like religious fog. The mainstream historical fact that will revolutionize your understanding of medieval spirituality is that monastery incense consumption was so enormous that it created international trade routes specifically dedicated to supplying religious establishments with aromatic materials, making frankincense and myrrh more valuable than gold in some medieval markets. But here's the quirky detail that reveals medieval religious priorities. Some monasteries employed professional incense readers, who claimed they could determine the spiritual state of individual monks by analyzing how their personal body odors interacted with the sacred smoke. These specialists would make recommendations about penance, fasting, and prayer based on their olfactory assessments of each monk's spiritual aroma. The incense itself created layers of aromatic complexity that evolved throughout the day. Morning prayers would fill the chapel with fresh frankincense that mixed with the night-accumulated odors of sleeping monks, creating what religious texts describe as the breath of angels mixed with the essence of humanity. By midday, the accumulated smoke would begin interacting with cooking smells from the monastery kitchen, creating unexpected aromatic combinations that could range from heavenly to absolutely nauseating. The evening services brought what monks called the sacred saturation, a point where the air became so thick with incense that it triggered altered states of consciousness that medieval religious authorities interpreted as divine visions but modern science would recognize as mild carbon monoxide poisoning combined with sensory overload. Historians still argue whether medieval monks genuinely believed that excessive incense use enhanced their spiritual experiences, or whether they simply used aromatic smoke as a coping mechanism for the overwhelming reality of communal living in buildings where personal hygiene was considered a form of vanity that distracted from spiritual concerns. The social hierarchy within monasteries was reflected in their relationship to incense exposure. Senior monks would position themselves closer to the incense burners during services, believing that greater exposure to sacred smoke would accelerate their spiritual development, while novice monks were relegated to areas where they received less aromatic benefit but also suffered less respiratory distress. Medieval monastery children, orphans and oblates raised within religious communities, developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe olfactory conditioning, becoming so accustomed to incense-saturated environments that they experience withdrawal symptoms when exposed to normal air. Some could identify different types of religious ceremonies simply by analyzing subtle variations in incense smoke composition. The religious implications of incense overdose created ongoing theological debates. Some medieval clerics taught that the smell of burning frankincense was literally the scent of prayers rising to heaven and that breathing incense-saturated air was a form of spiritual communion, while others worried that excessive aromatic stimulation was a form of sensory indulgence that distracted from proper contemplative practice. The economic impact of monastery incense consumption was enormous and far-reaching. Religious establishments would spend up to 30% of their annual budgets on aromatic materials, creating economic dependencies that affected international trade relationships and contributed to the exploration of new trade routes to aromatic-producing regions. Medieval monasteries developed increasingly elaborate incense-burning technologies, including complex ventilation systems designed to circulate aromatic smoke throughout entire buildings, specialized burners that could maintain continuous combustion for days at a time, and even primitive air filtration methods using wet cloth and charcoal to prevent the most toxic components of incense smoke from accumulating to dangerous levels. The seasonal variations in monastery incense use followed the religious calendar but also responded to practical concerns about odor management. Winter months would see increased incense burning as monks spent more time in enclosed spaces, while summer brought different challenges as heat would intensify both the incense smoke and the underlying human odors it was meant to mask. The medical implications were serious and well documented. Medieval physicians recognized that excessive incense exposure could cause what they called sacred lung, a condition characterized by chronic coughing, respiratory distress, and altered mental states. Some doctors recommended limiting time spent in heavily incensed environments, while others prescribed specific herbal remedies designed to protect against aromatic poisoning. The psychological effects on long-term monastery residents were profound and lasting. Many monks developed what religious texts describe as incense dependency, an inability to pray or meditate effectively without the presence of aromatic smoke. Some reported that they could no longer experience spiritual states without the familiar chemical environment of their incense-saturated chapels. The underlying odors that the incense was meant to mask created their own complex ecosystem. Hundreds of unwashed monks living in close quarters, combined with the distinctive smells of medieval religious practices, including the use of hair shirts, self-flagellation, and extended fasting that produced its own distinctive body chemistry, created a base layer of human odor that even massive quantities of frankincense couldn't completely overcome. Medieval monasteries also dealt with the accumulated smells of religious artifacts and practices that modern people rarely consider. Ancient manuscripts would develop their own musty odors from centuries of handling by unwashed hands. Religious relics would emit distinctive scents from their preservation methods, and the buildings themselves would absorb decades of incense smoke mixed with human occupation, creating permanent aromatic environments that could affect visitors for days after leaving. Remember those blacksmith forges with their harsh, metallic assault on your respiratory system? By now, you're probably thinking that breathing superheated metal fumes was a relatively straightforward, honest experience compared to the complex, overwhelming aromatic manipulation of medieval religious establishments that used sacred smoke to create spiritual experiences while simultaneously assaulting your senses with the concentrated essence of communal living without soap. The incense-saturated air from the monastery is still coating your throat like sacred syrup, but now you're stumbling toward what promises to be a different kind of aromatic nightmare, the warm, yeasty glow spilling from a medieval tavern where the sounds of drunken revelry mix with something far more disturbing than singing. You're approaching an alehouse where the floor is decorated with last night's festivities in the form of vomit puddles that have been marinating in sawdust and spilled ale for hours, creating a fermented cocktail of human digestive failure that makes everything you've experienced so far seem like a pleasant garden party. The tavern represents medieval society's most concentrated celebration of bodily excess, where people gather to drink ale so strong it could strip paint, eat food so questionable it would horrify modern health inspectors, and then proceed to expel the results of these decisions directly onto floors that haven't been properly cleaned since the building was constructed. You're entering a space where the smell of fresh vomit mingles with stale beer, rotting food scraps, and the accumulated body odor of patrons who consider bathing a seasonal activity at best. The vomit corners of medieval taverns were not accidents. They were architectural features. Tavern keepers would designate specific areas where patrons were expected to relieve themselves of excess alcohol and questionable food, creating concentrated zones of digestive horror that developed their own ecosystems of flies, rats, and bacterial cultures that could survive conditions that would kill most known life forms. The smell hits you in layers of increasing complexity and horror. The surface notes are sharp and acidic, the immediate assault of fresh stomach acid mixed with partially digested ale, and whatever passed for food in medieval taverns. The middle notes bring the yeasty, fermented smell of beer that has been regurgitated and left to continue fermenting in sawdust, creating an alcoholic compost that attracts insects from neighboring kingdoms. Medieval taverns operated as concentrated pollution factories for human digestive waste, serving ale so strong that vomiting wasn't just common. It was expected and planned for. The establishments would employ vomit boys, usually children or desperate adults who would clean up the worst messes in exchange for scraps of food and small coins, developing immunity to smells that would hospitalize modern emergency responders. The mainstream historical fact that will make you question medieval social gatherings is that tavern vomit was so common and voluminous that many establishments developed sophisticated drainage systems specifically designed to channel digestive waste away from drinking areas, creating underground networks of vomit channels that connected to the same waste rivers you encountered earlier in your olfactory journey. But here's the quirky detail that reveals medieval tavern culture. Some alehouses actually competed to see who could create the most spectacular vomiting displays, with patrons placing bets on the volume, distance, and artistic merit of their fellow drinkers' digestive performances. These competitions were considered high entertainment, and could draw crowds from miles around. The vomiting process in medieval taverns followed predictable patterns that tavern keepers learned to anticipate and manage. Fresh arrivals would produce relatively clean, beer-scented vomit that was considered the least offensive. Long-term drinkers would generate more complex digestive displays that included whatever questionable food they had consumed, creating aromatic combinations that could clear entire sections of the tavern. The most disturbing category was what tavern workers called the morning surprise, vomit from patrons who had been drinking for multiple days and were expelling digestive contents that had been fermenting in their stomachs for extended periods, creating biological weapons that could induce sympathetic vomiting in anyone within a 10-foot radius. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely enjoyed spending time in environments saturated with vomit smell, or whether they simply had no alternative social spaces available for gathering and entertainment. Some evidence suggests that tavern patrons developed psychological coping mechanisms that allowed them to ignore the olfactory assault, while other sources indicate that people were just as disgusted but considered the social benefits worth the sensory suffering. The social dynamics around tavern vomit were complex and revealing. Wealthy patrons would pay premium prices for tables positioned upwind from the designated vomit areas, while poor customers were relegated to spaces directly adjacent to the digestive waste zones. Some taverns developed elaborate seating hierarchies based entirely on proximity to vomit accumulation areas. Medieval tavern children, offspring of tavern keepers who grew up in these environments, developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe olfactory desensitization, becoming so accustomed to vomit-saturated air that they experienced discomfort in clean environments. Some could identify the drinking history and health status of patrons simply by analyzing the characteristics of their digestive emissions. The religious implications of tavern vomit created ongoing moral debates. Some medieval clerics taught that the smell of human digestive failure was a reminder of the consequences of gluttony and should inspire temperance, while others maintained that taverns served important social functions that justified tolerating their olfactory challenges. The economic impact of tavern vomit management was significant and ongoing. Establishments would spend considerable resources on sawdust, cleaning supplies, and replacement flooring materials, while also dealing with the property damage caused by acidic digestive waste that could eat through wood and stone over time. Medieval taverns developed increasingly creative methods for managing vomit accumulation, including specialized absorbent materials made from animal hair and plant fibers, drainage systems that could channel liquid waste away from drinking areas, and even primitive ventilation techniques designed to reduce the concentration of digestive odors in enclosed spaces. The seasonal variations in tavern vomit followed predictable but horrifying patterns. Summer heat would intensify the fermentation process, creating smell explosions during busy drinking periods that could affect entire neighborhoods, while winter brought different challenges as frozen vomit would accumulate for months before spring thaws released concentrated waves of preserved digestive waste. The medical implications were serious and well documented. Medieval physicians recognized that prolonged exposure to tavern vomit smell could cause what they called ale lung, a condition characterized by chronic nausea, respiratory distress, and an inability to consume alcohol without experiencing flashbacks to the worst tavern odors. The psychological effects on tavern workers were profound and lasting. Many developed what employment records describe as vomit madness, a condition characterized by obsessive cleaning behaviors, inability to eat certain foods, and chronic anxiety about digestive processes. Some tavern keepers reported that they could no longer enjoy meals because every food reminded them of its potential appearance in vomit form. The tools and equipment used in medieval taverns absorbed vomit smells so thoroughly that they became permanent sources of digestive odor. Wooden tables, leather drinking vessels, and stone floors would retain the acidic scents for years, creating what tavern workers called ghost vomit, that would continue emanating digestive odors long after the original incidents had been cleaned up. Medieval authorities developed increasingly sophisticated regulations for tavern vomit management, including mandatory cleaning schedules, designated waste disposal areas, and even primitive health inspections designed to prevent the most dangerous accumulations of digestive waste from creating public health hazards. Remember that monastery incense that seemed so overwhelmingly aromatic just moments ago. By now, you're probably thinking that breathing frankincense-saturated air was a relatively pleasant, spiritual experience compared to the aggressive, in-your-face assault of fermented human digestive waste that medieval taverns offered as the standard accompaniment to social drinking. The fermented vomit stench from the tavern is still burning your nostrils like alcoholic acid, but now you're approaching something that promises healing and relief. The distinctive herbal aroma drifting from the apothecary's shop where medieval medicine meets medieval madness in ways that will make you question everything you thought you knew about healthcare. You're entering an establishment where the sweet scent of healing herbs mingles with the putrid stench of animal organs, creating an aromatic battlefield between life and death that medieval physicians somehow convinced themselves was the path to wellness. The apothecary represents medieval society's most ambitious attempt at chemical warfare disguised as healthcare, where dried lavender and chamomile share shelf space with pickled bat wings, powdered unicorn horn, actually ground rhinoceros horns shipped from Africa, and jars of human urine aged to perfection in underground cellars. You're breathing air that combines the pleasant earthiness of genuine medicinal plants with the nightmare fuel of medieval pharmaceutical practices that would make modern drug regulators weep with horror. The smell hits you in competing waves of attraction and revulsion. The pleasant top notes of rosemary, thyme, and mint try desperately to mask the deeper, more disturbing odors of decomposing animal parts, fermented human waste, and chemical compounds that medieval alchemists created through processes they didn't understand but insisted were divinely inspired. Medieval apothecaries operated as concentrated museums of olfactory chaos, where every conceivable organic and inorganic substance was ground, boiled, fermented, or distilled in the pursuit of medical miracles. The shops would contain hundreds of jars, bottles, and containers filled with materials ranging from genuinely helpful herbs to substances so toxic they could kill customers faster than their original ailments. The mainstream historical fact that will revolutionize your understanding of medieval medicine is that apothecary shops were legally required to maintain detailed records of their most dangerous ingredients, not for safety reasons, but because many of their medicines were so valuable they required armed guards and were traded like precious metals in international markets. But here's the quirky detail that reveals medieval medical priorities. Some apothecaries employed professional smell testers, individuals who would sample the aroma of various medicines to determine their potency and quality. These specialists developed such refined olfactory abilities that they could identify fake ingredients, predict the effectiveness of treatments, and even diagnose certain diseases simply by analyzing the smell of patients' breath, sweat, and other bodily emissions. The preparation process itself created a symphony of competing odors that evolved throughout the day. Morning brought the pleasant sense of fresh herbs being ground and sorted, mixed with the sharper chemical smells of mineral compounds being processed. As the day progressed, the heat would begin activating the more volatile ingredients, creating complex chemical reactions that produced smells ranging from heavenly to absolutely toxic. The afternoon hours brought what apothecaries called the alchemical awakening, a time when various brewing, distilling, and fermentation processes would reach critical stages, releasing concentrated bursts of aromatic compounds that could range from pleasantly medicinal to dangerously hallucinogenic. Some customers would actually visit apothecary shops specifically to experience these aromatic highs, treating the establishments as medieval aromatherapy centers. Historians still argue whether medieval apothecaries genuinely believed in the medicinal value of their most horrific ingredients, or whether they simply used exotic and expensive materials to justify charging premium prices for treatments that were essentially placebos wrapped in olfactory theater. The social hierarchy of medieval medicine was reflected in the aromatic complexity of different treatments. Wealthy patients received medicines that smelled pleasant and exotic, incorporating expensive imported spices and rare aromatic compounds that created positive olfactory associations with healing. Poor patients were given treatments that smelled as horrible as they were cheap, often consisting of local herbs mixed with whatever organic waste the apothecary needed to dispose of. Medieval apothecary children, offspring of medicine makers who grew up surrounded by these aromatic chaos factories, developed what modern doctors would recognize as extraordinary olfactory sensitivity combined with severe chemical tolerance. They could identify hundreds of different medicinal ingredients by smell alone, predict the weather by detecting subtle changes in how various compounds reacted to atmospheric pressure, and even diagnose illnesses by analyzing the complex interactions between patient odors and medicinal aromas. The religious implications of apothecary smells created ongoing theological debates. Some medieval clerics taught that pleasant medicinal aromas were evidence of divine blessing and healing power, while horrible-smelling treatments were tests of faith that required patients to endure olfactory suffering as part of their spiritual purification. Other religious authorities worried that apothecaries were practicing a form of aromatic sorcery that could corrupt both healers and patients. The economic impact of apothecary aromatic practices was enormous and far-reaching. The demand for exotic-smelling ingredients drove international trade relationships, funded exploration expeditions to aromatic-producing regions, and created entire industries dedicated to processing, preserving, and transporting medicinal materials that were valued primarily for their olfactory properties rather than their actual therapeutic effects. medieval apothecaries developed increasingly sophisticated methods for managing their aromatic chaos, including specialized storage systems that could prevent different smells from contaminating each other, ventilation techniques designed to channel the most toxic fumes away from customer areas, and even primitive air filtration methods using charcoal and wet cloth to reduce the concentration of dangerous chemical vapors. The seasonal variations in apothecary smells followed both the agricultural calendar and the disease patterns of medieval society. Spring brought fresh herbs and the pleasant sense of new growth, while summer intensified all aromatic compounds and accelerated the decomposition of organic ingredients. Autumn was harvest season for medicinal plants, creating concentrated periods of aromatic processing, while winter brought the challenge of preserving medicinal materials without refrigeration, leading to increased use of fermentation and chemical preservation techniques that produced their own distinctive odors. The medical implications were both beneficial and terrifying. While some apothecary treatments genuinely helped patients, others were so toxic that the smell alone could cause respiratory distress, hallucinations, and permanent olfactory damage. Medieval physicians recognized that certain medicinal aromas could trigger healing responses, but they also documented cases of medicine poisoning caused by excessive exposure to aromatic compounds. The psychological effects on apothecaries themselves were profound and lasting. Many developed what medical records describe as aromatic obsession, a condition characterized by compulsive smelling behaviors, inability to function in environments without complex odors, and chronic anxiety about the quality and potency of medicinal aromas. Some apothecaries reported that they could no longer enjoy simple pleasures like food or flowers because their olfactory systems had been permanently altered by years of exposure to concentrated medicinal compounds. The tools and equipment used in medieval apothecaries absorbed medicinal smells so thoroughly that they became permanent sources of aromatic emission. Wooden mortars and pestles, ceramic storage jars, and metal distillation equipment would retain complex medicinal odors for decades, creating what apothecaries called ghost medicines that would continue emanating therapeutic aromas long after the original ingredients had been used up. Medieval authorities developed increasingly complex regulations for apothecary aromatic practices, including licensing requirements for handling the most dangerous smelling ingredients, mandatory ventilation standards for shops that process toxic compounds, and even primitive quality control measures designed to prevent the most harmful aromatic medicines from reaching the general public. Remember that tavern vomit that seemed so aggressively disgusting just moments ago? By now, you're probably thinking that fermented digestive waste was a relatively straightforward, honest smell compared to the complex, contradictory aromatic battlefield of medieval apothecaries, where the promise of healing was wrapped in olfactory experiences that could range from paradise to absolute hell depending on which jar the medicine maker decided to open next. The competing herbal chaos from the apothecary is still coating your sinuses like medicinal warfare. But now you're approaching something that represents medieval engineering at its most ambitiously disgusting, the castle moat, where stagnant water has been transformed into a biological weapon that makes everything you've experienced so far seem like a gentle introduction to the true horrors of medieval defensive architecture. You're walking toward a fortress surrounded by what can only be described as a liquid graveyard, where green, festering water serves as home to floating debris, decomposing animals, and human waste that has been marinating in medieval sunshine for months or possibly years. The castle moat represents the ultimate expression of medieval society's ability to turn basic sanitation into a weapon of war, where water that was once clean and life-giving has been deliberately transformed into a concentrated biological hazard that could kill attackers through smell alone. You're approaching a defensive feature that combines the stagnant stench of pond scum with the putrid odor of decomposing organic matter, the sharp chemical bite of human and animal waste, and the distinctive sweet sick smell that comes from water that has achieved a level of pollution so complete it has become a living ecosystem of death. The smell hits you from hundreds of yards away. A wall of stagnant water odor so intense it seems to have physical weight, pressing against your face like a wet, putrid blanket that follows you even when you try to escape. This isn't just the smell of dirty water, it's the concentrated essence of biological warfare, where every organic substance that could possibly decompose has been allowed to ferment in standing water until it achieved a level of toxicity that would impress modern chemical weapons experts. Medieval castle moats operated as concentrated sewage treatment facilities designed by people who had never heard of bacteria but somehow managed to create perfect breeding grounds for every disease-causing organism known to medieval medicine. The moats would receive direct drainage from castle latrines, kitchen waste, stable runoff, and the occasional corpse of enemies who had been thrown in as both disposal method and psychological warfare tactic. The mainstream historical fact that will revolutionize your understanding of medieval warfare is that castle moats were so toxic that they served as effective biological weapons, with documented cases of besieging armies retreating not because of military defeat, but because the smell from the moat was causing mass illness, vomiting, and psychological breakdown among the attacking forces. But here's the quirky detail that reveals medieval military priorities. Some castle defenders would deliberately enhance their moat's toxicity by adding specific organic materials designed to create the most psychologically disturbing smells possible. They would throw in rotting fish, decomposing animal carcasses, and even human waste mixed with aromatic herbs to create smell combinations that could induce panic attacks and temporary madness in approaching enemies. The moat ecosystem itself was a marvel of medieval biological engineering, where stagnant water provided the perfect environment for algae blooms that turned the surface bright green, while the depths harbored anaerobic bacteria that produced gases so toxic they could kill small animals that ventured too close to the water's edge. The floating debris created its own aromatic hierarchy, with fresh additions producing sharp, immediate smells that gradually evolved into the deeper, more complex odors of advanced decomposition. The seasonal variations in moat toxicity followed predictable but horrifying patterns. Summer heat would intensify all biological processes, creating smell explosions that could affect entire regions around major castles, while also producing visible gas bubbles that would rise to the surface and burst, releasing concentrated puffs of toxic vapor that witnesses described as the devil's breath. Historians still argue whether medieval castle defenders genuinely understood the biological principles behind moat toxicity, or whether they simply discovered through trial and error that certain combinations of organic waste would create the most effective olfactory weapons. Some military treatises suggest sophisticated understanding of how different materials would decompose in water, while other sources indicate that moat management was based more on superstition and tradition than scientific knowledge. The social implications of living near castle moats were profound and lasting. Peasant communities located downwind from major fortifications would experience chronic health problems, reduced property values, and what medieval physicians called moat madness, a condition characterized by chronic nausea, respiratory distress, and psychological symptoms that modern doctors would recognize as the effects of long-term exposure to toxic gases. Medieval castle children, offspring of nobles and servants who grew up within fortress walls, developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe environmental trauma, becoming so accustomed to moat stench that they experienced anxiety and discomfort when exposed to clean air. Some could predict weather changes, seasonal variations, and even approaching military threats by detecting subtle changes in moat odor patterns. The religious implications of castle moat smells created ongoing theological debates. Some medieval clerics taught that the stench of moat water was a reminder of the corruption of earthly power and should inspire humility in rulers, while others maintained that defensive moats were divinely sanctioned weapons that demonstrated God's protection of righteous causes, making their horrible smells a form of holy warfare. The economic impact of moat maintenance was enormous and ongoing. Castles would spend significant resources on materials designed to enhance moat toxicity, including specialized organic additives, drainage systems that could channel the most offensive waste into the water, and even professional moat tenders, who would monitor and adjust the biological composition to maintain optimal defensive effectiveness. Medieval military engineers developed increasingly sophisticated methods for maximizing moat toxicity, including specialized drainage systems that could concentrate waste from multiple sources, ventilation techniques designed to trap toxic gases near the water surface, and even primitive chemical additives that could accelerate decomposition and enhance the production of noxious odors. The medical implications were serious and well documented. Medieval physicians recognized that moat exposure could cause what they called siege sickness, a condition characterized by chronic respiratory problems, digestive distress, and psychological symptoms that could persist for years after exposure. Some doctors recommended avoiding castle areas entirely during certain weather conditions, while others prescribed specific treatments designed to counteract the effects of moat poisoning. The psychological effects on castle defenders were equally significant. Many developed what military records describe as moat immunity, a condition where prolonged exposure to toxic odors created psychological numbness that extended beyond olfactory sensitivity to include reduced emotional responses to violence, death, and suffering. Some castle guards reported that they could no longer experience normal human emotions because their sensory systems had been permanently altered by years of breathing moat-contaminated air. The engineering challenges of moat construction and maintenance created their own specialized knowledge base. Castle builders had to understand water flow patterns, drainage systems, and biological processes well enough to create and maintain water features that could remain toxic for decades while still serving their defensive purposes. Medieval siege warfare was significantly influenced by moat toxicity, with attacking armies developing specialized equipment and tactics designed to minimize exposure to moat-generated biological weapons. Some military units would use primitive gas masks made from cloth and aromatic herbs, while others would attempt to approach castles only during specific weather conditions that would minimize their exposure to toxic vapors. The long-term environmental impact of castle moats was devastating and permanent. The concentrated biological pollution would contaminate groundwater, kill vegetation for miles around major fortifications, and create dead zones where normal plant and animal life could not survive. Some former castle sites remained uninhabitable for centuries after the fortifications were abandoned, simply because the environmental damage from decades of moat toxicity was too severe to remediate with medieval technology. Remember that apothecary herb chaos that seemed so contradictory and overwhelming just moments ago? By now, you're probably thinking that the competing aromas of medieval medicine were a relatively pleasant, civilized experience compared to the concentrated biological warfare of castle moats, where stagnant water had been transformed into a weapon so effective it could defeat armies through smell alone. The toxic moat vapors are still burning your respiratory system like biological warfare. But now you're approaching something that promises sustenance and survival. The warm, yeasty glow emanating from the baker's shop, where the comforting aroma of fresh bread mingles with something far more sinister that will make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval food safety. You're entering an establishment where the pleasant scent of baking grain battles against the putrid stench of moldy flour, rat-infested storage areas, and bread made from ingredients so questionable they would make modern health inspectors declare biological warfare on the entire medieval baking industry. The baker's shop represents medieval society's most dangerous gamble with food production, where the line between nourishment and poison was determined by factors completely beyond the baker's control: weather, storage conditions, and the simple reality that medieval grain often contained more fungus than actual wheat. You're breathing air that combines the genuinely pleasant aroma of fresh bread with the musty, sweet sick smell of ergot-infected rye, the sharp chemical bite of grain that has fermented in damp storage conditions, and the distinctive rodent urine scent that comes from flour that has been sharing storage space with rats for months. The smell hits you in waves of false comfort followed by genuine horror. The surface notes are warm and inviting, the familiar scent of baking bread that triggers every positive association your brain has with food and safety. But underneath lurks something far more disturbing: the musty, organic stench of grain that has been slowly rotting in medieval storage conditions, creating chemical compounds that could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Medieval bakeries operated as concentrated biological hazard zones disguised as food production facilities, where bakers worked with ingredients they couldn't properly inspect, using storage methods that guaranteed contamination, and serving customers who had no choice but to eat whatever was available or starve. The shops would contain massive quantities of grain that had been stored in conditions perfect for developing toxic molds, bacterial infections, and infestations of vermin that contributed their own aromatic signatures to the final products. The mainstream historical fact that will terrify you about medieval food production is that ergot poisoning from contaminated rye bread was so common that entire communities would experience mass hallucinations, convulsions, and death, with some historians suggesting that events like the Salem witch trials were actually caused by ergot-contaminated grain supplies that drove entire populations temporarily insane. But here's the quirky detail that reveals medieval baking priorities. Some bakers actually developed reputations for producing dream bread, loaves made from ergot-contaminated rye that would cause mild hallucinations and euphoric states in customers. These establishments would charge premium prices for bread that was essentially a medieval psychedelic drug, with wealthy customers specifically requesting loaves made from the most contaminated grain available. The baking process itself created a complex aromatic evolution that masked the true dangers lurking in medieval bread production. Fresh loaves would emit the pleasant, yeasty scents that customers associated with quality and nutrition, while the heat of baking would temporarily suppress the musty odors of contaminated grain. Only after cooling would the bread begin to reveal its true aromatic nature, as the underlying fungal and bacterial contamination reasserted itself. The storage areas behind medieval bakeries were aromatic nightmare factories where grain would be kept in conditions that guaranteed contamination. Damp cellars, wooden containers that harbored bacteria and fungus, and the constant presence of rats and other vermin created environments where the grain would develop complex ecosystems of decay that contributed their own distinctive smells to the final bread products. Historians still argue whether medieval bakers genuinely understood the connection between grain contamination and the health problems experienced by their customers, or whether they simply accepted a certain level of poisoning as an inevitable part of food production. Some guild records suggest sophisticated knowledge of grain quality assessment, while other sources indicate that bakers were just as likely to be poisoned by their own products as their customers. The social hierarchy of medieval bread consumption was reflected in the aromatic quality of different products. Wealthy customers received bread made from the finest available grain, which still contained significant contamination but smelled relatively pleasant and caused fewer immediate health problems. Poor customers were given bread made from the worst grain available, often consisting of materials that were more fungus than wheat, creating loaves that smelled like decomposing organic matter and could cause immediate illness. Medieval baker children, offspring of bread makers who grew up surrounded by contaminated grain and toxic baking environments, developed what modern doctors would recognize as chronic poisoning symptoms combined with extraordinary tolerance for food-related toxins. They could identify different types of grain contamination by smell alone, predict weather changes by detecting how atmospheric conditions affected grain storage, and even diagnose various illnesses by analyzing the complex interactions between customer body odors and the aromatic compounds released by contaminated bread. The religious implications of bread contamination created ongoing theological debates. Some medieval clerics taught that contaminated bread was a test of faith that required Christians to trust in divine protection while consuming potentially poisonous food, while others maintained that bakers had a moral obligation to provide safe nutrition and that selling contaminated bread was a form of murder that would result in eternal damnation. The economic impact of bread contamination was enormous and far-reaching. Communities would experience periodic population crashes when particularly toxic grain supplies caused mass poisoning events, while the constant low-level contamination created chronic health problems that reduced productivity and shortened lifespans across entire regions. Medieval bakers developed increasingly desperate methods for managing grain contamination, including primitive sorting techniques designed to remove the most obviously infected materials, storage methods that attempted to prevent further deterioration, and even chemical additives that could mask the smell and taste of contaminated ingredients without actually improving their safety. The seasonal variations in bread contamination followed predictable but horrifying patterns. Wet seasons would accelerate fungal growth in stored grain, creating more toxic bread during certain times of year, while dry periods would concentrate existing contamination and create different types of health hazards. Spring brought the challenge of using grain that had been stored through winter, often revealing contamination that had been developing for months. The medical implications were serious and well documented. Medieval physicians recognized that bread consumption could cause what they called baker's madness, a condition characterized by hallucinations, convulsions, and progressive neurological damage that modern doctors would recognize as ergot poisoning. Some doctors recommended avoiding bread entirely during certain seasons, while others prescribed specific treatments designed to counteract the effects of grain contamination. The psychological effects on bakers themselves were profound and lasting. Many developed what guild records describe as grain paranoia, a condition characterized by obsessive inspection behaviors, chronic anxiety about food safety, and inability to enjoy eating their own products. Some bakers reported that they could no longer taste bread normally because their sensory systems had been permanently altered by years of exposure to contaminated grain aromas. The tools and equipment used in medieval bakeries absorbed contamination odors so thoroughly that they became permanent sources of toxic off-gassing. Wooden mixing bowls, stone grinding surfaces, and clay storage vessels would retain fungal and bacterial contamination for years, creating what bakers called ghost grain that would continue contaminating fresh ingredients long after the original contaminated materials had been used up. Medieval authorities developed increasingly complex regulations for bread production, including guild standards for grain quality, mandatory inspection procedures for storage facilities, and even primitive quality control measures designed to prevent the most dangerous contaminated bread from reaching the general public. However, these regulations were largely ineffective because medieval technology was simply inadequate for properly assessing or preventing grain contamination. The long-term health impact of medieval bread consumption was devastating and permanent. Entire populations would experience chronic neurological damage, shortened lifespans, and genetic effects that could persist for generations, all because the basic staple of medieval diet was routinely contaminated with toxins that medieval people couldn't detect, understand, or prevent. Remember that castle moat with its concentrated biological warfare that seemed so overwhelmingly toxic just moments ago. By now, you're probably thinking that stagnant water filled with decomposing organic matter was a relatively straightforward environmental hazard compared to the insidious, hidden dangers of medieval bread production, where the most essential food for survival was routinely contaminated with toxins that could drive entire communities insane while smelling like comfort and home. The deceptively comforting bread aromas mixed with toxic grain contamination are still coating your throat like poisonous comfort food, but now you're approaching something that represents medieval industry at its most chemically aggressive. The textile dyeing workshops where the air itself has been transformed into a rainbow of toxic vapors that will make everything you've experienced so far seem like a gentle introduction to the true horrors of medieval chemical warfare disguised as fashion. Production. You're entering a district where the sharp, acrid bite of ammonia mingles with the metallic burn of mineral compounds, creating an atmospheric assault so intense it could strip paint from buildings and permanently alter your DNA. The dyer's workshop represents medieval society's most ambitious attempt at chemical manipulation, where the pursuit of vibrant colors required the use of substances so toxic they could kill workers faster than enemy armies. You're breathing air that combines the sharp ammonia burn of fermented human urine with the metallic bite of mercury compounds, the acidic sting of mineral acids that medieval alchemists created without understanding their lethal properties, and the distinctive chemical cocktail that comes from boiling heavy metals in enclosed spaces without any concept of ventilation or worker safety. The smell hits you like a physical assault from a chemistry set designed by someone who actively hated human life. The immediate impact is the ammonia burn that makes your eyes stream tears instantly, followed by the deeper, more sinister chemical bite of compounds that your body recognizes as poison even though your medieval brain has no concept of molecular toxicity. This isn't just an unpleasant smell. It's your respiratory system's desperate attempt to warn you that you're breathing air that could cause permanent organ damage with each inhalation. Medieval dye workshops operated as concentrated chemical weapons factories disguised as textile production facilities, where workers would spend 12-hour shifts breathing vapors that contained mercury, lead, arsenic, and other heavy metals that medieval people valued for their ability to create brilliant colors while remaining completely ignorant of their capacity to cause brain damage, organ failure, and genetic mutations that could affect generations of offspring. The mainstream historical fact that will revolutionize your understanding of medieval fashion is that textile dyers had the shortest lifespans of any medieval profession, with most workers dying before age 30 from what modern doctors would recognize as heavy metal poisoning, but which medieval physicians attributed to color madness, or rainbow sickness, that they believed was caused by exposure to too much visual beauty. But here's the quirky detail that reveals medieval priorities. Some wealthy customers would actually visit dye workshops specifically to experience the hallucinogenic effects of breathing chemical vapors, believing that exposure to color spirits could enhance their artistic abilities and spiritual awareness. These chemical tourism visits were considered fashionable entertainment among the nobility, who would pay premium prices for guided tours through the most toxic workshops available. The dyeing process itself created a symphony of chemical reactions that produced smells ranging from merely unpleasant to immediately lethal. Different colors required different toxic compounds. Brilliant reds used mercury and cinnabar, creating vapors that could cause neurological damage within hours. Deep blues required arsenic compounds that produced sweet-smelling gases that were actually more dangerous than their pleasant aroma suggested. Vibrant yellows used lead-based materials that created metallic vapors capable of causing permanent brain damage. The most dangerous stage was what dyers called the color awakening, the moment when heated metals would begin vaporizing and releasing their most toxic compounds into the air. Workers would often experience immediate symptoms including dizziness, hallucinations, and temporary blindness, which they interpreted as signs that the dyeing process was working correctly rather than evidence that they were being slowly poisoned to death. Historians still argue whether medieval dyers understood the connection between their chemical processes and their health problems, or whether they simply accepted shortened lifespans and chronic illness as the price of creating beautiful colors. Some guild records suggest sophisticated knowledge of which compounds were most dangerous, while other sources indicate that dyers genuinely believed their symptoms were caused by supernatural forces rather than chemical poisoning. The social dynamics around dye workshops were complex and revealing. Wealthy neighborhoods would pay enormous sums to prevent dyers from establishing workshops nearby, not just because of the smell, but because the chemical contamination would kill vegetation, stain buildings, and create environmental damage that could persist for decades after the workshops were abandoned. Medieval dyer children, offspring of textile workers who grew up surrounded by toxic chemical vapors, developed what modern doctors would recognize as severe developmental disorders caused by chronic heavy metal exposure. Many exhibited symptoms that medieval people attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment, including neurological problems, behavioral abnormalities, and physical deformities that were actually the result of chemical poisoning that began in the womb. The religious implications of dye workshop toxicity created ongoing theological debates. Some medieval clerics taught that the ability to create beautiful colors was a divine gift that required workers to accept physical suffering as a form of spiritual purification, while others maintained that the health problems experienced by dyers were evidence that certain chemical processes were inherently evil and should be forbidden by Christian authorities. The economic impact of dye workshop toxicity was enormous and far-reaching. While the textile industry was essential for medieval commerce, the environmental and health costs were devastating. Entire districts would become uninhabitable due to chemical contamination, while the constant need to replace workers who died from poisoning created ongoing labor shortages that affected textile production across entire regions. Medieval dyers developed increasingly desperate methods for managing their toxic working conditions, including primitive protective equipment made from cloth and leather that provided minimal protection against chemical vapors, ventilation systems that were completely inadequate for the volumes of toxic gases being produced, and even chemical antidotes that were often more dangerous than the original poisons they were meant to counteract. The seasonal variations in dye workshop toxicity followed predictable but horrifying patterns. Summer heat would intensify all chemical reactions, creating more concentrated toxic vapors that could affect entire neighborhoods, while winter brought different challenges as enclosed workshops would trap chemical gases at dangerous concentrations that could cause immediate poisoning of anyone who entered. The tools and equipment used in medieval dye workshops absorbed toxic compounds so thoroughly that they became permanent sources of chemical contamination. Wooden bats, metal tools, and stone surfaces would retain heavy metals and other toxic substances for decades, creating what dyers called ghost chemicals that would continue poisoning workers long after the original contaminated materials had been replaced. Medieval authorities developed increasingly complex regulations for dye workshop operations, including licensing requirements for handling the most dangerous chemicals, mandatory safety procedures that were completely inadequate for the actual risks involved, and even primitive environmental protection measures designed to prevent the most severe chemical contamination from spreading to surrounding areas. The medical implications were serious and well documented. Medieval physicians recognized that dye workshop exposure could cause what they called color death, a condition characterized by progressive neurological damage, organ failure, and eventual death that modern doctors would recognize as classic heavy metal poisoning. Some doctors recommended avoiding dye districts entirely, while others prescribed treatments that were often more toxic than the original chemical exposure. The psychological effects on dyers themselves were profound and lasting. Many developed what guild records describe as chemical madness, a condition characterized by hallucinations, violent mood swings, and progressive mental deterioration that was actually the result of chronic brain damage from heavy metal exposure. Some dyers reported experiencing permanent changes in their perception of color and light that made normal visual experiences impossible. The long-term environmental impact of medieval dye workshops was devastating and permanent. The chemical contamination would persist in soil and groundwater for centuries, creating dead zones where normal plant and animal life could not survive. Some former dye workshop sites remained uninhabitable well into the modern era, simply because the chemical contamination was too severe to remediate with available technology. The international trade implications were equally significant. The demand for toxic dyeing materials drove exploration and colonization efforts, funded military campaigns to secure access to mineral deposits, and created economic dependencies that shaped international relationships for centuries. The pursuit of beautiful colors literally poisoned entire civilizations while driving the expansion of global commerce. Remember that baker's shop with its deceptively comforting bread hiding toxic grain contamination? By now, you're probably thinking that eating poisonous food was a relatively subtle, gradual health hazard compared to the immediate, aggressive chemical assault of medieval dye workshops, where the pursuit of beautiful colors required workers to breathe air so toxic it could cause permanent brain damage with each breath while creating environmental contamination that would persist for centuries. The toxic rainbow of chemical vapors from the dye workshop is still burning your lungs like liquid poison, but now you're approaching the final destination in your medieval olfactory nightmare, the graveyard, where the sweet, cloying smell of decomposing human flesh mingles with the earthy scent of disturbed soil to create an aromatic finale that will make everything you've experienced so far seem like a pleasant warm-up for the true horror of medieval death management. You're walking among overcrowded cemeteries where shallow graves release their secrets with every rainfall, creating a concentrated zone of human decay so intense it has developed its own weather patterns and attracted scavengers from 3 different kingdoms. The medieval graveyard represents the ultimate expression of society's complete failure to manage death with any dignity or sanitation, where the sweet, nauseating stench of decomposing human flesh combines with the musty odor of disturbed earth, the sharp chemical bite of lime that authorities desperately dump on corpses, and the distinctive bacterial cocktail that develops when human bodies are buried in conditions that guarantee they'll return to haunt the living through smell alone. The smell hits you from hundreds of yards away, a wall of death stench so concentrated it seems to have achieved consciousness, pressing against your face like the ghostly hands of everyone who ever died badly in medieval times. This isn't just the smell of death, it's the concentrated essence of humanity's mortality, where every person who ever lived and died in medieval conditions has contributed their aromatic signature to a collective olfactory monument to the inevitability of decay. Medieval graveyards operated as concentrated biological hazard zones where bodies were buried in conditions that guaranteed maximum decomposition odor. The combination of shallow graves, overcrowding, poor soil drainage, and the complete absence of embalming techniques created perfect conditions for producing the most intense death smells possible, while also ensuring that these odors would continue emanating from the ground for months or years after burial. The mainstream historical fact that will haunt your dreams is that medieval graveyards were so overwhelmed with bodies during plague years that they developed corpse overflow systems, designated areas where bodies would be stacked above ground until burial space became available, creating temporary mountains of decomposing human flesh that could be smelled from miles away and attracted scavengers that would spread disease and body parts throughout surrounding communities. But here's the quirky detail that reveals medieval death management. Some graveyards employed professional smell readers, who claimed they could determine the spiritual state of the deceased by analyzing the odor of their decomposition. These specialists would charge families premium prices for detailed reports about whether their loved ones were experiencing peaceful decay, indicating salvation, or particularly foul-smelling decomposition, suggesting damnation. The decomposition process in medieval graveyards followed a horrifying timeline that created different aromatic stages throughout the months following burial. Fresh burials would produce the sharp, metallic smell of recent death mixed with the earthy odor of disturbed soil. After several weeks, the sweet, cloying stench of active decomposition would begin, attracting clouds of flies and creating what witnesses described as death flowers, visible blooms of insects that would mark grave locations from considerable distances. The most disturbing stage was what gravediggers called the sweet awakening, a period several months after burial when decomposition gases would begin escaping from graves in concentrated bursts, creating smell explosions that could clear entire neighborhoods and were said to cause immediate nausea in anyone who encountered them. These aromatic eruptions were so predictable that some communities developed calendars based on expected decomposition schedules. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood that graveyard smells were connected to disease transmission, or whether they simply accepted death stench as a natural part of urban life that required no special management. Some evidence suggests that medieval physicians recommended avoiding graveyards during certain weather conditions, while other sources indicate that people genuinely believed the smell of decomposing bodies was spiritually beneficial and should be embraced as a reminder of mortality. The social hierarchy extended even into death management, with wealthy families paying premium prices for burial locations upwind from the general population graves, while poor families were relegated to areas where their deceased relatives would contribute to the concentrated death stench that affected entire communities. Some graveyards developed elaborate burial hierarchies based entirely on wind patterns and odor dispersion. Medieval graveyard children, offspring of gravediggers and church officials who grew up surrounded by decomposing bodies, developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe psychological trauma combined with extraordinary tolerance for death-related odors. They could identify different stages of decomposition by smell alone, predict weather changes by detecting how atmospheric conditions affected grave emissions, and even determine the cause of death by analyzing the specific characteristics of decomposition odors. The religious implications of graveyard smells created ongoing theological debates. Some medieval clerics taught that the stench of decomposing bodies was a reminder of human mortality that should inspire proper Christian behavior, while others maintained that excessive exposure to death smells could corrupt the soul and lead to unhealthy obsessions with mortality and decay. The economic impact of graveyard odor management was significant and ongoing. Communities would spend considerable resources on lime, herbs, and other materials designed to reduce death stench, while also dealing with the property damage caused by the acidic gases released during decomposition that could corrode buildings and kill vegetation for considerable distances around burial sites. Medieval graveyards developed increasingly desperate methods for managing decomposition odors, including specialized drainage systems designed to channel decomposition gases away from populated areas, burial techniques that attempted to accelerate or control the decay process, and even primitive chemical treatments that often made the smell worse while creating additional health hazards. The seasonal variations in graveyard smells followed predictable but horrifying patterns. Summer heat would intensify all decomposition processes, creating smell explosions during warm weather that could affect entire regions around major burial sites, while spring rains would disturb shallow graves and release concentrated waves of preserved decay that had been accumulating through winter months. The medical implications were serious and well documented. Medieval physicians recognized that graveyard exposure could cause what they called death sickness, a condition characterized by chronic respiratory problems, digestive distress, and psychological symptoms that modern doctors would recognize as the effects of prolonged exposure to decomposition gases and bacterial contamination. The psychological effects on gravediggers and church officials were profound and lasting. Many developed what religious records describe as death madness, a condition characterized by obsessive behaviors related to mortality, inability to enjoy normal life pleasures, and chronic anxiety about their own eventual decomposition. Some gravediggers reported that they could no longer eat meat because every meal reminded them of the human flesh they encountered in their professional duties. The long-term environmental impact of medieval graveyards was devastating and permanent. The concentrated biological pollution would contaminate groundwater, create dead zones where normal plant life could not survive, and establish bacterial ecosystems that would persist for centuries after the graveyards were abandoned or relocated. As you stand among these medieval graves, breathing air that carries the concentrated essence of human mortality, you realize that this final smell represents something more than just another unpleasant odor. It's the culmination of everything you've experienced: the waste, the decay, the chemical toxicity, the biological warfare, all leading to this inevitable conclusion where every medieval person's olfactory journey ended in the same sweet, cloying stench of decomposition. The graveyard smell doesn't just assault your senses, it whispers the truth that medieval people lived with every day, that in a world without proper sanitation, medical knowledge, or chemical safety, death wasn't just inevitable, it was aromatic, persistent, and impossible to escape. Every breath you take in this medieval graveyard carries the molecular remnants of thousands of people who experienced the same olfactory horrors you've just witnessed, and who ultimately contributed their own aromatic signature to the endless cycle of medieval decay. Remember that dye workshop with its aggressive chemical assault that seemed so immediately dangerous just moments ago. By now, you understand that even the most toxic industrial processes were just temporary stops on the journey toward this final destination, where the sweet smell of human decomposition serves as the ultimate reminder that in medieval times, every olfactory experience was just a preview of the aromatic fate that awaited everyone who dared to live in a world where death smelled like home. And so, as the sweet, cloying essence of medieval mortality settles around you like a gentle blanket of ancient decay, you begin to understand something profound about the human experience across time. These 7 smells, the rotting fish markets, the flowing waste rivers, the toxic tanning workshops, the acrid smoke of burning flesh, the sweet death clouds of plague houses, the metallic blood of butcher shops, and finally, the concentrated essence of human decomposition in overcrowded graveyards. They weren't just unpleasant background odors in medieval life. They were the aromatic soundtrack to an entire civilization, the olfactory fingerprint of a society that lived so close to the edge of survival that every breath carried the molecular memory of life, death, and everything in between. Medieval people didn't just tolerate these smells. They were shaped by them, defined by them, and ultimately, unified by them in ways that our sanitized modern world can barely comprehend. As you slowly drift away from this aromatic journey through medieval time, let yourself imagine the extraordinary resilience of people who could build cathedrals and create art while breathing air that would hospitalize modern humans. Let yourself marvel at the human capacity to find beauty, love, and meaning in a world where every sense was constantly assaulted by the raw, unfiltered reality of organic existence. The medieval nose experienced life in ways we can barely imagine, not just the horrors we've explored tonight, but also the simple pleasures that would have seemed miraculous against such an aromatic backdrop. The scent of a single flower, the clean smell of rain, the warmth of bread that wasn't contaminated, these would have been olfactory treasures beyond our modern comprehension. So as you settle into your clean, sanitized, wonderfully odorless modern world, remember that you carry within your DNA the genetic memory of ancestors who survived these aromatic challenges and passed their resilience down through generations. Every breath you take in your pleasantly scented environment is a gift from people who breathe air that could kill, and who somehow found ways to not just survive, but to create the foundations of the world we inhabit today. Sleep well, knowing that your medieval olfactory journey is complete, and that tomorrow you'll wake up in a world where the most challenging smell you'll encounter is probably someone's overly enthusiastic use of cologne. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be filled with the gentle, clean air that medieval people could only dream of breathing.